So let's move now to the main program, and it's a great honor to have with us Louise Archer Kerr from the Department of Education and Professional Studies in King's College London, but also a representative from the Aspirations project. Louise?
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to be able to share the findings from our research study. So the research we've been doing has been a study of children's science and career aspirations from age 10 to 14. Now, you could say, why study aspirations? Because often few of us are doing the job today that we aspired to do when we were children. But aspirations are interesting for various reasons. They're a crucial time when young people form their ideas about the future. And also large-scale studies, like the ones referenced in the middle bullet point here, show us that although they are not deterministic, there is a strong relationship between the aspirations you have at age 14 and what you go on to do later. So, for example, a very large quantitative study from the United States by Tai et al. Shows that children who aspire to a science career at age 14 are nearly 3.5 times more likely to end up doing a degree in the physical sciences or engineering in the future. In the UK, aspirations are also a feature of our policy as well. There's a lot of interest from government in the idea that if we just raise young people's aspirations, then everything else will fall into place and get better. So we're interested in investigating that idea more and being critical about it. So our project is, it's now a 10-year study. We're halfway through, but this is about the first 5 years. And it's picking up children, looking at their ideas through surveys and interviews at the ages of 10, at the end of primary school, and again at the age of up to 12 and then 13, 14. We've surveyed, as you can see from the slide, over 18,000 young people in this. And we've also done in-depth qualitative interviews with the young people and their parents. So looking across all this survey data, what do young people aspire to? Well, as you can see there, they are quite ambitious. They largely aspire to professional and managerial careers. Not just wanting to make money, they are also altruistic as well. They want to help other people. So some good ideas too. So one of the ideas that is often put forward for why not many young people go into science is that maybe they don't find science interesting. But our data suggests that most of them do like science. So from primary into secondary school, you can see there a high proportion say that they find science interesting. They have very good things to say about their teachers. They think their teachers encourage them and motivate them and teach them well. And this is good news for English science teaching. And there's not often a lot of good news for English science teachers, so it's good for us to say they're doing a good job in that respect. So it's not that they don't find science interesting. Another idea that we often have is that maybe it's views of scientists, negative stereotypes of scientists that is the problem. But again, our research suggests that most young people have reasonably positive views of scientists. So they think they make a difference in the world, they think they make a lot of money, which not all scientists agree with. But generally, the problem is not necessarily one of negative stereotypes of scientists. They're quite positive about them. But even despite these positive views, nobody wants to go on and become a scientist in the future. So you can see the columns there. So the first three, the different colours relate to the different age groups. But they say they learn interesting things, they say their parents value science, they have positive views of scientists. But the last set of columns is who aspires to go on to a career in science. And it's very low. So we call this the being-doing divide. So children like doing science, They just don't want to be a scientist. So our research is interested in understanding this gap, what causes this difference. So it could also be, you could say, what do they aspire to then? If they don't want to do science, maybe they don't want to do anything. So we asked them lots of questions about their aspirations, and this chart, the writing's a bit small, but the very biggest bar at this end is for business. So the majority of young people in our study, and this is 14-year-olds and 13-year-olds, they're very, very positive. They all want to go into business. The second one, right from the other end, is scientist. So scientist, not very popular at all. Now, there are lots of problems with this graph, so you can't take it too much just as it is, because you could say, well, what's business? What do they mean by business? And it could mean lots and lots of things. It could mean owning your own hairdressing salon, a bit mobile business. It could mean being the boss of a big company that makes lots of money. So in a sense, that's why there's a lot of children in that category. But the interesting thing is that the aspiration for business was the most equal out of all aspirations. So it had the best gender balance, it had the best social class balance, and it had the best ethnic balance. It was the most democratic aspiration. Whereas, as we'll talk about in a minute, careers like scientist or engineer were mostly white middle-class boys. So there's something interesting around business that young people see it as, for me, potentially something I could do. And there's this idea that anyone can go into business. You don't have to be the best in your class, you just have to want to do it. We do have reality TV shows in Britain around business. I don't know if you have them in other countries as well, like The Apprentice and Dragon's Den, if you have those. But that's sort of playing into that idea. But what we're interested in is that science doesn't have that discourse, those ideas associated with it. So I'm going to explain a bit more about how they see science in a minute. So as I said, that little column of who aspires to science jobs was quite particular. As you can see there, it's more boys, more middle-class pupils, and more South Asian and minority ethnic young people as well. Now, the first two are not surprising, I think, but the last one is interesting because, again, you see the proportion of black students, of African Caribbean students, who aspire to science careers is actually high, much higher than the proportion who go on to take them. So again, it suggests that the problem is not necessarily aspiration alone. And the students who aspire to take science also tend to be from affluent backgrounds. They tend to be, we have sets or streams for science. They tend to be in the top set, and they have a family member who works in science job already. So I'm just going to try and talk through a few of the key reasons that we think create these patterns. So the first is the concept of science capital. So this is an idea that we've developed in the study, and it's basically trying to bring together any science-related resources that young people might have. So whether it's qualifications, knowledge, interest, knowing someone in your family who works in a science-related job. And we've tested this idea of science capital out in a more recent study that we're doing at the moment called Enterprising Science with a nationally representative sample. And you can see here that of young people currently in the UK of this age group, about 5% have high science capital, most are in the middle, but 27% have low science capital. And we think that's actually quite high, and it suggests there's a need to do more to help increase that. So we see science capital as working through the family as well. It's built by schools too, but the family is very important. So we've drawn on some sociological ideas here, particularly the work of Pierre Bourdieu, who suggests that the habitus, the way that you see the world, your unconscious, taken for granted ways of being in the world are important. And these create the sense of, in families, of what's normal for us, what's normal for someone like me. And this family context, family habitus, interacts with science capital. And it can mean that some career paths just come to be seen as normal. It's not even necessarily a choice. So lots of girls in our study would talk about how their parents would say to them, "Oh, you're so good with children. They always look after their siblings or their cousins," and they'd be told these sorts of things every day, and they aspire to be teachers or childcare workers and so on. In the case of science, this is particularly strong. So a family with a lot of science capital is much more likely to have a child who wants to continue with science in the future. And there's just, as you can see, the more percentage of children, a higher percentage of children whose families work in a science-related career have a science aspiration there. And they're much more likely to want to continue with science, to study it post-16, irrespective of their aspiration. So even if they want to be an author, if you have a family member who, like a parent who works in a science job, then you're more likely to say, well, I still want to study science at 18 because I know it's useful for life, for everything. So we tried to show how different levels of science capital relate to different sorts of aspiration. So as you can see here, the left-hand bar, children with low science capital. The green is if you aspire to a science job, like scientist. Red is if you refer to a STEM job, so like largely being a doctor or a vet related to science. And blue is anything else. So you can see here that if you have low science capital, you are much more likely to aspire to anything else than science, and the more science capital you have, the more likely you are to want to study a science or science-related job in the future. So this is when they're age 10 in primary school. And if you keep looking at the green on the top of the low science capital column, so the left-hand column, look at the green at the top. So this is when they're 10. When they're 14, it's smaller, even smaller. So we think the effect of science capital increases over time. And as you can see, that the pattern becomes stronger. So we were quite surprised how consistent children's aspirations were. So we expected, coming into the study, that children, each time we interviewed them, would choose something completely different. So we thought, when you're 10, maybe you want to be an astronaut. Maybe when you're 13, an author. Maybe when you're 14, something else again. But actually, they were quite consistent. Over 3/4 of all young people, their aspirations stayed within the same broad category. So the categories are broad, but they didn't move between them as much as we expected. And as you can see, if you have high science capital, you're much more likely to stay within a science or a STEM-related aspiration. And with low, you're much more likely not to have a STEM aspiration. And we also found that of the children with low science capital, not a single child consistently aspired to a science job from age 10 to 14. So in high and medium science capital, they tended to be the same kids aspiring to those jobs. With low science capital, different children aspired. They moved in and out. They're much more fluid. So we tried to look at, well, how do the families with high science capital do it? What are they doing to get their children to want to do science? So science was highly visible in their lives. These families were doing lots of science activities at the weekends. They were making olive oil lava lamps on the kitchen table with their children, things like that. They made science, they valued it, they conveyed the value of science, and they made it normal in their lives. And it was part of their identity. So there's a quote there from a mum, and the mother she's a chemist, a scientist herself, and she's saying, well, the other day, we were in the car and we were just laughing about chemical symbols and things. So it's quite subliminal. Now, I would question whether that's that subliminal, because they're talking about chemical symbols in everyday life. Not everybody does that. But they were very good, these families, at conveying the importance of science for citizenship. And it's just an example here of a boy I interviewed, and he's called Bill. He's a white middle-class boy, and his dad is a scientist. And when I first interviewed him, he wanted to go into a job to do with the army. When I next interviewed him, he was more interested in being a food writer. So I said, why don't you want to do the army anymore? Because he loves military history and things like that. And he'd been paintballing. Do you have paintballing? And it hurt. So he didn't want to go into the army anymore. When I interviewed him again, he'd changed again his ideas. But at age 14, you can see up there, he's saying he's aspiring to be a historian or a journalist, or maybe a bit of science. Now, his aspirations surprised his father, but in a sense, and delighted his father. His father was a scientist. But in a sense, it shouldn't have been surprising, because his dad had been telling him from the day he was born about the importance of science. So every day, all the time, be a scientist, science is good. So in a sense, there is no escape for Bill. He will do something to do with science. And there are just some quotes there again about how it's not just his dad who's a scientist, but all his other family in the bottom half there. He says, all my other family are scientists. There's a lot of science capital there. And his dad at the end also says, we talk about science at the dinner table. It's there. It's there in everyday life. So they were the minority of our families, and they're doing a lot of work to promote science to their children, but they were the minority. Most families in our study had benign or ambivalent views of science, and science was very much absent in their daily lives. They couldn't tell you where it was. So most of those had lower science capital. And most of these children are what we call interested but. So they say, I'm interested in science, but I'm not going to continue with it. And there was a higher proportion of working class and minority ethnic black and white families in there. So these families were very much, their approach to parenting is more hands-off. It's more, as long as the child is happy, let the child make decisions about education, unlike the science families who are hothousing their children. Everything is about education, everything is about science. So these families are much more relaxed in that way. And there's some quotes there at the bottom showing how for them, they can't see where science is in everyday life. And as the children at the bottom say, they've never asked their parents about science. So very different conversations. So the problems with this lack of science capital, we think, is that most young people and their parents have very little idea of where science can lead. They think you only study science if you want to be a scientist, a science teacher, or a doctor. And if they don't want to aspire to one of those jobs, then they're not going to continue with science because they don't see its relevance. They don't understand that it can be transferable in the labour market, that it can be useful for lots of jobs. And there's just a couple of quotes there from a student and a parent showing that they can see why English and maths are useful, but why science? So I think we have more work to do to convey this to young people and families as to why it's useful for everybody, not just if you want to be a scientist. And the importance of this perception of transferability is shown by the UpMap study. It's a study at the Institute of Education in London. And they looked at reasons for choosing maths or physics after 16. And they found that one of the most important predictive factors is whether you think it will be useful to you in your future job. So children who understand this will take those subjects, and if they don't, they won't.